Well, Prince Carwash is in a panic now. He finally decides to go see a lawyer and tells the lawyer everything that's happened. And he says, how do we get out of this? Do we have any defenses? And the lawyer kind of shakes his head and says, well, you had some great defenses. You had a U.S. Supreme Court case. Well, first of all, you had the Eighth Amendment, which says not only that there shall be no cruel and unusual punishments, but there shall also be no excessive fines. And the 14th Amendment says that that law, which originally only applied to actions taken by the federal government, also applies to actions taken by the state and local government. So it looks like this was an excessive fine, and you might have been able to get it set aside, especially since there's a U.S. Supreme Court case and 2 California State Supreme Court cases that talk about excessive fines and tend to work in your favor. First of all, the U.S. Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Bajikajian was an interesting case where a man who was a legal immigrant in this country had worked hard and made a lot of money, and he wanted to take some of the money back to his home country, as many immigrants do, maybe to help his family or to start a business there. But we have a federal law that says if you're taking more than $10,000 in cash out of our country, you have to report it to the immigration, or the Department of Immigration, so that we can be sure you paid the income taxes on it before you take it out of the country. Well, Mr. Bajikajian, I guess he didn't want to pay the taxes, so he took $347,000. No, it was $357,144 in cash in his suitcases and tried to sneak it out of the country, but he got caught. And when he got caught, the U.S. Customs Department said, well, your penalty is you forfeit all $357,144. Mr. Bajikajian was in a panic, and he said, wait, all my hard-earned money, you're going to make me forfeit all of it? I mean, slap me on the wrist, fine me, a couple of $1,000s or something, but don't take all $357,144 of my hard-earned money. So he appealed this, and it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, a penalty of forfeiture of the whole $357,144 is an excessive fine. It violates the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. You got to give Mr. Bajikajian his money back. Prince Carwash says, well, that sounds pretty good. What else have you got? So, well, there's a state Supreme Court case, a California case, Lockyer versus R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. And we had decided in California that we were going to try to prevent young people from getting addicted to tobacco. And we set a new law that said no giving away of free samples of tobacco in California, because that's one of the ways that you get young people addicted. And if you do get caught giving away free samples of tobacco, it'll be $200 fine for the first time you get caught, a $500 fine for the second time you get caught, and a $1,000 fine for every time you get caught after that. Well, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company thought they had an exception to the rule, so they proceeded to give away hundreds or thousands of free samples of tobacco in California, and they got caught. And the person that caught them added up all the violations and said, you owe the state of California $14,826,200. Well, as you might imagine, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company was a little upset with this $14 million fine. They appealed it all the way up to the state of California Supreme Court, and they said that's just an excessive fine. State Supreme Court said, you're right, it violates the 8th and 14th Amendments. Give R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company their money back. So, those are interesting cases, but perhaps the most interesting case, maybe the most directly related to yours, is the California case of Hale versus Morgan. That was a landlord and tenant case where the landlord, who needed to get some tenants out of his apartment, decided, well, I don't want to go through the expensive legal eviction process, so I know another clever way, a different clever way to get them out. I'll just cut the tenant's utilities off. I'll cut off his electricity and his phone and his water, and he'll have to get out. Well, this has been tried many times before. In fact, it's been tried by landlords at bad times, like in the middle of the winter snowstorms, and people have frozen to death. There have been horrible things that have happened. So in California, it's against the law for a landlord to cut off the utilities in a residential rental property in order to evict the tenants. And the fine at that time was $100 a day for each day that you had cut off the tenant's utilities. So this landlord was fined $100 a day, and the landlord contested the fine, saying that's an excessive fine, it's too much money. And sure enough, the California court said a fine of $100 a day is an excessive fine, and you have to give it back. So now Prince Carwash is dancing a jig. He says, man, it sounds like we got him. We got the 8th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, a U.S. Supreme Court case, and 2 California Supreme Court cases. How can we lose? Let's go to court and fight this thing. The lawyer kind of sadly hangs his head and shakes his head and says, you don't understand, Prince Carwash. You had all of those legal defenses that you could have raised at the first hearing when you went to see the administrative law judge. But because you didn't come to see the lawyer, and you didn't know those laws, and you did not raise those legal defenses at that first hearing, you have lost your right to raise them any time in the future. Any of the future court hearings or administrative law hearings, you're only allowed to raise on those later appeals the legal defenses that you raised at the first hearing. Since you didn't raise any of those at the first hearing, you've lost the right to raise them now. You might as well pay the $10,000 fine because you've lost all of your rights to defenses. Poor Prince Carwash, this was the straw that broke his financial back, and he finally had to sell that business. He lost his piece of the American dream.